My name is Jason Miller. I am 37 years old, a cybersecurity consultant based in Denver, Colorado, and for most of my adult life, I have built everything around stability, logic, and long-term thinking, which is probably why the shift in my marriage hit me so hard, because it did not happen with a dramatic explosion, but with subtle, almost invisible adjustments that slowly rewired the entire dynamic between me and my wife, Brittany. Brittany is 33, a senior operations manager at a firm called Northbridge Collective. And when we first met, she was sharp, grounded, pragmatic, the kind of woman who could dissect a problem in 5 minutes and still laugh at herself at the end of the day. And that grounded confidence was one of the things that pulled me toward her, because I have always respected competence more than flash. We have been married for 6 years, and in the beginning we operated like a true partnership. We both worked demanding jobs. We both supported each other's goals, and our conversations were about strategy, growth, travel plans, investments, and building something solid together. And I genuinely believed we were building a life that was steady and resilient. I work in cybersecurity, which means my days are filled with analyzing threats, anticipating vulnerabilities, and thinking 3 steps ahead, and I approach our marriage the same way, always trying to reinforce the structure, to protect it, to make sure it would last. The shift began after Brittany landed a major promotion at Northbridge Collective, the kind of promotion that came with a pay raise, public recognition, and a new level of visibility inside her industry. And I was proud of her because I had seen how hard she worked for it, how many late nights she put in, how many presentations she rehearsed in our living room. Around the same time, she started building a personal branding page online, at first just posting professional insights, leadership tips, behind-the-scenes glimpses of corporate life. And I thought it was smart because visibility can be leveraged in her field. At first, it felt harmless, even exciting, watching her follower count climb, seeing her posts gain traction, reading comments from people who admired her perspective, and I supported her fully. I helped her set up better lighting in our home office. I proofread captions. I even took photos for her when she wanted something that looked polished but authentic. Somewhere along the way, though, the tone changed, and it was not immediate. It was gradual, almost like watching a slow software update, rewrite a system, without any visible reboot. Her posts became less about substance and more about image, more about validation, more about carefully curated shots of her at networking events, her at conferences, her at rooftop dinners with executives, and she started checking her phone constantly, refreshing for comments, analyzing engagement metrics the way I analyze breach reports. Conversations at home shifted too. Instead of discussing ideas, we began dissecting reactions. Instead of talking about how her team was performing, we talked about how her audience was responding. And if a post underperformed, her mood would sour for the entire evening. What unsettled me most was how our marriage slowly became part of performance. How she would position me in photos like a supporting character rather than a partner, tagging me only when it fit the narrative, describing me as a rock in a caption that read more like branding copy than genuine appreciation. In public, she would hold my hand and lean into me when cameras were around. But once we were alone, she seemed distant, distracted, already scrolling, already drafting the next post in her head. I began to feel like a background prop in my own life, the stable husband who looked good in pictures, who symbolized balance and support, but whose presence was no longer truly engaged. When I tried to bring it up, when I told her I missed a version of us that talked about real things instead of optics, she would dismiss it lightly, saying I was overthinking, saying this was just how modern professional growth worked, saying I should be proud that she was finally getting the recognition she deserved. I was proud, but pride started to coexist with something heavier, a quiet erosion of intimacy, a sense that I was watching my wife step onto a spotlight stage and slowly rotate away from me toward an invisible audience that seemed to matter more each day. And as someone whose entire career is built around identifying vulnerabilities, I could not ignore the one forming inside my own marriage. I have always shown love through dependability because that is a language I understand best, the quiet, steady acts that hold a life together without demanding applause. And from the beginning of our marriage, I made it my mission to be the foundation Brittany could stand on without ever worrying about cracks forming beneath her feet. When we bought our house in Silver Creek Estates, a $610,000 mortgage that felt intimidating even with both our incomes combined, I ran the numbers for weeks before we signed anything, calculating risk scenarios, stress testing our finances the same way I would test a corporate network for vulnerabilities, making sure that no matter what happened, we would not lose a roof over our heads. I took on the responsibility of managing the bills, automating payments, monitoring interest rates, refinancing when it made sense, tracking our investments, and ensuring that every dollar had a purpose, because to me security is not just digital, it is emotional and financial and structural. I planned small weekend trips to the mountains or quiet cabins outside Denver, not extravagant vacations designed for social media, but intentional breaks where we could disconnect and reconnect, where we could talk without notifications interrupting every sentence. I handled the unglamorous details of life without resentment because I believed that stability was romantic in its own way, that being predictable in the right ways was a gift, not a flaw. As Brittany's salary climbed to nearly $210,000 a year after her promotion, I genuinely celebrated her success. I toasted to it in our kitchen with expensive bourbon. I told friends how proud I was of her. I reminded her that she earned every bit of it through discipline and intelligence. At first, the increased income simply meant we were more comfortable, that we could accelerate savings, upgrade a few things around the house, donate more generously. But gradually, the financial shift seemed to alter something deeper in how she perceived both herself and me. She began framing me as unambitious in subtle ways that only later became obvious when I replayed conversations in my head, making comments in front of her colleagues about how I was content with my stable consulting work, while she was out there building something dynamic and expansive, describing my career in cybersecurity as safe and routine, even though the work I do protects companies from catastrophic breaches and requires constant adaptation to evolving threats. She would laugh lightly and call me predictable, saying it like a harmless joke, but the tone carried an edge that made it clear she no longer viewed predictability as strength. At networking events, she would introduce me with a tone that suggested I was background context rather than a partner, emphasizing her own trajectory while minimizing mine, and I would stand there in tailored suits that I paid for with years of disciplined work, listening as she positioned herself as a visionary and me as a steady but unremarkable spouse who simply maintained the infrastructure at home. I started noticing how often she compared our growth, how frequently she used phrases like next level and expansion when describing herself while describing me in words that implied stagnation. At home, real conversations became increasingly rare, replaced by the constant glow of her phone screen illuminating her face late into the night as she scrolled through comments and private messages, responding to strangers with enthusiasm while offering me distracted nods when I tried to share something about my day. I would sit on the edge of our bed talking about a complex security case I had resolved or a client who avoided a multi-million-dollar loss because of my intervention, and she would murmur that was great without looking up, her attention tethered to digital validation. The mortgage payments continued leaving my account every month. The bills stayed current. The house remained immaculate. The weekend trips were still planned with care, but inside the structure I had so carefully maintained I began to feel diminished, like the dependable framework she once admired had become in her eyes evidence of smallness rather than strength. I was not chasing applause. I was building durability. Yet in her new narrative, durability looked boring, and the more she leaned into the spotlight of her rising income and growing online presence, the more I felt like I was being quietly rewritten as a man who lacked ambition simply because I did not perform mine for an audience. The breaking point came on a Thursday night at Hawthorne Grill, a sleek upscale restaurant downtown that Brittany insisted was the perfect place for her team dinner because it matched the image she wanted to project. All dark with accents, exposed brick walls, dim amber lighting, and a long polished bar lined with people who looked like they were auditioning for a business magazine cover. I had come straight from a client meeting, still carrying the mental fatigue of a 12-hour day spent auditing a corporate network for vulnerabilities, but I changed into a charcoal blazer and drove there because showing up for her mattered to me even when I was exhausted. Her co-workers were already seated at a long table near the center of the restaurant, glasses of wine half full, appetizers scattered between them, laughter rising in sharp bursts as I approached. Brittany looked flawless. Perfectly styled hair, tailored black dress, posture straight and confident in a way that made it clear she felt completely in her element. She introduced me with that same polished tone I had grown accustomed to, smiling in a way that felt rehearsed rather than intimate, and I shook hands with everyone, including Dylan Parker, a flashy sales executive whose suit was a little too tight and whose watch seemed intentionally visible every time he gestured. Dylan had that aggressive charisma salespeople cultivate, the kind that fills space whether invited or not, and he kept leaning slightly toward Brittany as if proximity alone could signal importance. The conversation revolved around quarterly performance, revenue spikes, upcoming expansion strategies, and Brittany spoke with animated authority, clearly enjoying the attention of her team as they nodded and complimented her leadership. I sat quietly for most of it, listening, occasionally contributing a brief comment when the topic brushed against cybersecurity or data protection, but mostly observing the dynamic between them. I noticed how often Dylan jumped in to praise her vision, how he laughed a little too quickly at her jokes, how his eyes lingered on her when she spoke, and I felt that familiar low burn of discomfort in my chest that I had been trying to ignore for months. At one point, the conversation shifted to travel, someone mentioning a recent trip to Napa, another talking about a conference in Miami, and I made a lighthearted comment about how I could use a vacation myself after the last few weeks of back-to-back client crises, saying it with a small smile meant to ease the tension I felt. It was not a complaint. just an attempt to participate, to insert a sliver of relatability into a conversation that had been orbiting around professional triumph. I glanced at Brittany, expecting at least a shared look, some acknowledgement of the weekends I had planned for us in the past, the quiet getaways that never made it to her social feed. Instead, she laughed loudly, louder than necessary, drawing the attention of the entire table before saying that maybe when I learned to earn her attention, she would consider giving me a vacation, her voice carrying just enough edge to transform what could have been playful into something sharp and deliberate. The table erupted in laughter, not cruel exactly, but enthusiastic, the kind of laughter that feeds on social cues and power dynamics, and I felt every pair of eyes flick toward me for a split second before returning to her. Dylan leaned back in his chair grinning, adding something about how high performers require high standards, and Brittany nodded as if the comment aligned perfectly with her narrative. I forced a small smile, the muscles of my face tightening as heat crept up my neck, and I took a slow sip of water to keep my hand steady. Inside, I was burning with a mixture of humiliation and disbelief, replaying her words in my head. The implication that my presence, my effort, my entire role in her life had to compete for her attention like some applicant in an audition. The rest of the dinner blurred into a haze of clinking glasses and overlapping voices, while I sat there feeling like a prop placed at the table to complete an image, my mind racing with the realization that what she had said was not a joke, but a reflection of how she truly saw me. I had paid the mortgage on our home, managed every bill, built a life designed to support us both, and yet in that moment at Hawthorne Grill, I was reduced to a punchline. A predictable husband who needed to earn the right to be noticed by his own wife, and the laughter echoing around that table settled into my chest like something heavy and permanent. After that night at Hawthorne Grill, I did not explode. I did not confront her in the parking lot. I did not demand an apology in the car ride home, because something inside me had shifted from reactive to analytical, from emotional defense to quiet recalibration, and instead of arguing, I chose to withdraw in a way that was subtle but absolute. I stopped chasing her approval in small, everyday ways. I stopped waiting for her to look up from her phone to acknowledge a story about my day. I stopped making playful comments designed to reconnect us when she drifted into that performance tone she carried home from work. I continued paying the mortgage on our house in Silver Creek Estates, continued managing the bills, continued maintaining the life we had built, but I stopped investing emotional energy into convincing her that I was worth noticing. When she made sarcastic jabs about my predictability or my so-called safe career, I did not defend myself anymore. I did not counter with logic or remind of the stability my work provided. I simply acknowledged the comment with a neutral nod and returned to whatever I was doing. I stopped competing with her online audience for attention, stopped offering to take photos for her branding page, stopped proofreading captions, stopped reacting when she dissected engagement metrics at the dinner table. My silence was not passive-aggressive. It was controlled, deliberate, and detached, and at first it confused her because she was used to some form of response, whether defensive or playful. She began watching me more closely, as if trying to provoke the old version of me back into existence, tossing sharper remarks into conversations to see if they would land. When they did not, when I remained calm and emotionally unavailable in a way that mirrored her own distance, irritation replaced confusion. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened when I did not ask follow-up questions about her posts, in the way she lingered in doorways, waiting for me to comment on her outfit, and then walked away when I simply said she looked nice without inflection. The escalation was gradual but unmistakable. She started dressing more provocatively at home, even when there was nowhere to go, fitted dresses and heels on random Tuesday evenings, makeup done with precision of someone preparing for an audience rather than a quiet dinner. She would walk to the living room slowly, adjusting a strap or smoothing her hair, glancing at me from the corner of her eye as if measuring whether I reacted. I would glance up briefly and then return to my laptop or the book in my hand, not out of indifference, but out of refusal to participate in a dynamic that felt transactional. Soon the insinuations began, comments delivered in a tone that was half joking and half accusatory, suggesting that maybe my new calmness meant I had found attention elsewhere, hinting that men who withdraw emotionally usually have someone waiting in the wings. I did not rise to it, did not defend myself passionately or demand she retract the implication, because engaging would have meant stepping back into the cycle of validation and competition. I simply stated facts when necessary and allowed the silence to stretch between us like an exposed wire neither of us wanted touch. Her late-night networking events increased around the same time, more dinners, more drinks, more strategy sessions that conveniently ran past midnight, and the name Logan Hayes began appearing in her stories and casual mentions. Logan was a newly hired marketing director at Northbridge Collective, younger, charismatic in a polished corporate way, the kind of man who understood optics as instinctively as I understood encryption protocols. She would mention how innovative his ideas were, How refreshing it was to work with someone who understood momentum, and I would listen without visible reaction, even as I cataloged the pattern forming some nights. She would come home energized from these events, phone buzzing with notifications, recounting conversations that sounded more like flirtatious banter than strategic planning. And when I responded with measured neutrality, it seemed to frustrate her further. It was as if my withdrawal denied her both the reassurance of my pursuit and the drama of my jealousy, leaving her without the feedback loop she had grown accustomed to. Inside, I felt the weight of it all, the slow erosion of what we once had. But outwardly, I maintained composure, not because I did not care, but because I refused to beg for attention from my own wife, and that quiet refusal altered the balance between us more than any argument ever could. By the time my suspicions hardened into something concrete, I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was observing, cataloging, and documenting the way I would during a forensic audit, because years in cybersecurity had trained me to recognize patterns long before they escalated into undeniable breaches. The first change was subtle. Brittany's phone, which had once sat face up on the kitchen counter, now remained face down at all times, notifications silenced. Screen brightness lowered at night, as if light itself might expose something. I noticed password changes on shared streaming accounts and cloud storage we had both accessed for years. Minor details that on their own meant nothing, but together formed a quiet shift toward compartmentalization. She began stepping into other rooms to answer messages, laughing softly at texts she would not share, her thumb moving rapidly across the screen before she locked it whenever I entered the space. The late-night networking events became more frequent, and the explanations grew rehearsed, phrased with just enough corporate terminology to sound plausible while avoiding specifics. I did not accuse her, did not search her phone directly, because confrontation without proof would only give her the opportunity to reshape the narrative and position me as paranoid or insecure, and I refused to hand her that leverage. The confirmation came on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when she asked me to grab something from her work tote while she was in the shower, and as I reached inside, I found a folded receipt tucked between a leather planner and a cosmetic pouch. It was from a Grand Arcadia hotel downtown, dated 3 nights earlier, listing a $489 king suite and a couple's tasting package in a rooftop restaurant, the kind of curated experience marketed toward anniversaries and romantic escapes rather than corporate strategy sessions. I stood there holding the paper longer than necessary, reading the itemized charges twice to ensure I was not misinterpreting what was plainly printed in black ink. I did not confront her with it. I simply returned it exactly where I had found it and continued the afternoon as if nothing had shifted, because in that moment I understood that certainty is more powerful than accusation. A few days later, she mentioned another late meeting, this time framed as a crucial branding discussion with Logan Hayes, and the name landed differently now that I had the receipt burned into memory. I told her to drive safely, watched her leave, and then waited 15 minutes before getting into my own car, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while following the route I knew would lead downtown. When she pulled into the parking entrance of the Grand Arcadia Hotel, I remained across the street, parked near a row of dimly lit storefronts, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. I was not shaking, not enraged, just methodical, observing the way her car disappeared into the underground garage. I waited, engine off, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, the city noise blending into a distant hum. After nearly 2 hours, I saw them exit through the main entrance under the warm glow of the hotel's canopy lights, Brittany and Logan walking side by side, with familiarity that did not require interpretation. She was laughing, head tilted slightly toward him, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that was neither accidental nor professional, fingers lingering just a second too long before sliding down toward his wrist. Logan leaned in close as he said something that made her smile widen, and the intimacy in her body language was unmistakable, not exaggerated but comfortable, practiced. I lifted my phone slowly and captured several photos from a distance, careful with angles and timing, documenting the moment without drawing attention. They stood there for a minute before he reached for her hand briefly, a gesture so natural it could only have been repeated before, and she did not pull away. I felt a tightening in my chest then, not explosive anger, but the final confirmation of what I had already accepted internally. When they separated and she headed back toward the garage alone, I waited until she was out of sight before starting my car and driving home by a different route, choosing patience over confrontation, because in my world, evidence is not for dramatic reveals, but for strategic decisions. The moment that truly severed something inside me did not come from the receipt or the photos I had taken outside the Grand Arcadia Hotel. It came unexpectedly on a quiet Saturday afternoon when Brittany asked me to grab a document from her SUV while she was upstairs getting ready for yet another networking event. Her vehicle was parked in the driveway, engine off, but the infotainment system still active because she had remote started earlier, and as I opened the driver's side door, the Bluetooth connection reactivated automatically, her phone pairing instantly and projecting the call she was on through the car speakers. I froze when I heard Logan's voice mid-sentence, low and confident, asking her if I suspected anything. And then I heard Brittany laughing away I had not heard directed at me in a long time, unguarded and sharp. She said that I was too boring to leave, too proud to question her, and too safe to replace, her tone casual and almost amused as if she were describing a piece of furniture rather than a husband. She went on to say that I just existed, that I handled the bills, paid the mortgage, and kept everything stable without demanding anything exciting in return, and that as long as she played her part publicly there was no risk of disruption. Logan made a comment about how convenient that must be, and she agreed, saying that I was predictable in the best way for her, dependable enough to fund a lifestyle, and too composed to create drama. And then she laughed again, that same laughter I had heard at Hawthorne Grill, when she told me I needed to earn her attention. Standing there in the driver's side doorway of her SUV, listening to my own existence reduced to a strategic advantage, I felt something inside me shift from quiet endurance to decisive clarity. I did not slam the door or confront her upstairs. I simply stepped back, closed the vehicle gently, and walked into the house with a steadiness that surprised even me. The anger was there, but it was contained, channeled into a cold focus that felt more powerful than any outburst could have been. In cybersecurity, we call it recognizing a persistent threat actor, the moment you understand that what you are dealing with is not accidental but intentional, not emotional but calculated. That afternoon, I opened my laptop in the study and began researching Summit Federal Bank, a local institution known for discretion and efficient account management. And within hours, I had scheduled an appointment to open a new personal account solely in my name. Over the next week, I rerouted a portion of my consulting income there, maintaining enough in our joint accounts to avoid suspicion, while quietly creating financial distance that she would not notice immediately. I updated direct deposits, adjusted automated transfers, and documented everything with precision because I knew stability would matter in what was coming simultaneously. I scheduled a consultation with a property attorney regarding the deed to our house in Silver Creek Estates, bringing copies of the mortgage agreement, payment records, and documentation showing that I had been the primary contributor to the $610,000 obligation since the beginning. Sitting in that office, reviewing the legal structure of ownership and equity, I felt none of the humiliation that had accompanied her public remarks months earlier, only a measured determination to protect myself from further exploitation. The switch had flipped not because she cheated, not even because she lied, but because she openly articulated that I was safe to manipulate, that my steadiness was something to exploit rather than respect. In that moment, I understood that the version of me she relied on, the predictable provider who would never disrupt the image, no longer existed, and I began restructuring my life with the same discipline I used to secure compromised systems, quietly, methodically, and without announcing the breach. I arranged a final dinner on a quiet Friday night, setting the dining room table with deliberate care, lighting candles that cast a warm, steady glow against the walls of the house in Silver Creek Estates that I had financed and maintained for years, cooking one of the meals Brittany used to love before everything became about optics and performance. There was no anger in my movements, no trembling in my hands, just a calm precision that came from knowing this was not an attempt to fix anything but to close something properly. When she walked in, she seemed mildly surprised by the effort, complimenting the setup with that polished smile she used in public, then immediately slipping into casual conversation about her day. She told me about meetings, about strategy sessions, about how demanding the week had been, carefully curated details that painted a picture of ambition and momentum while omitting anything personal. I listened without interruption, watching the rhythm of her storytelling, noticing how naturally she lied now, how seamlessly she filled in the gaps with corporate language. When she finished, I nodded, took a sip of wine, and placed a small envelope on the table between us. She looked at it with mild curiosity before opening it, and inside were copies of the receipt from the Grand Arcadia Hotel, the itemized charge of a $489 King Suite, and the couple's tasting package, along with printed photographs of her and Logan standing under the hotel canopy, laughing, her hand wrapped around his arm. She did not panic, did not break down, did not even attempt denial. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly as if relieved the secret was no longer concealed. She said she had outgrown me, her tone almost clinical, explaining that I represented stability but not evolution, that the affair had been meaningless in the grand scheme of things, just something that made her feel alive and seen in ways she claimed our marriage no longer provided. She spoke as though this were an inevitable upgrade, as though personal growth required discarding whatever felt too familiar, and she implied that Logan was simply a catalyst, not a replacement. I let her finish without interruption because the words themselves were confirmation of everything I had already processed. And when the silence settled, I told her calmly that I was moving out within a week and that the house would soon be listed. For the first time that evening, her composure cracked slightly, confusion flashing across her face as she reminded me that the house was ours, that we had built it together. I informed her that 3 years earlier during refinancing, I had restructured the mortgage solely in my name due to her fluctuating income documentation at the time, a practical decision that had seemed minor then, but now carried significant weight. The realization settled over her gradually. The understanding that without my income covering the mortgage and without her name on the refinance loan, the financial security she had treated as background noise was no longer guaranteed. I explained that my attorney would handle the sale and that the proceeds would be distributed according to the legal structure already in place, and that I had already separated my finances weeks prior. The candles continued to burn steadily between us as she processed the shift in power, the dynamic she had relied on quietly dissolving. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as Logan's presence diminished once the novelty of secrecy and risk disappeared. Once the stability I provided was no longer subsidizing her lifestyle. The excitement that had fueled their connection faded under the weight of practical reality, and I moved forward with the same discipline I had always lived by, not loudly, not vindicatively, but decisively, leaving behind the version of myself she had described as too safe to replace, and ensuring that the stability she had underestimated was no longer hers to stand on. In the weeks after I moved out and the house was listed, Brittany did what she understood best. She attempted to control the narrative, shaping it the same way she curated her online presence, framing our separation as a natural consequence of living with a distant and insecure man who could not handle her growth. Through carefully worded posts and subtle comments to mutual acquaintances, she implied that I had emotionally checked out long before anything happened, that my predictability had turned into coldness, and that her need for expansion had been misunderstood rather than betrayed. I saw fragments of it through shared contacts and the occasional forwarded screenshot, but I refused to engage publicly, refused to defend myself in comment sections or participate in the kind of digital theater she thrived on. Silence, I had learned, was not weakness when it was intentional. I focused instead on rebuilding the parts of my life that had been quietly neglected while I tried to hold our marriage together. I reconnected with friends I had not seen in years, men who knew me before I became a supporting character in someone else's performance, and we met for early morning workouts, weekend hikes in the Rockies, and long unfiltered conversations that did not revolve around image or validation. I returned to training with the same discipline I once had in college, lifting heavy, pushing my body to its limits, feeling strength return not just physically but mentally as well. Travel, something I had once planned carefully for us, became something I pursued for myself, not extravagantly but intentionally. Short trips to places that demanded presence rather than performance, coastal towns where my phone stayed in my pocket, mountain lodges where the only audience was the horizon. Each experience stripped away another layer of the identity she had reduced me to, the boring, safe man who just existed. I did not post about these trips in any curated way. I did not announce reinvention. I simply lived it quietly and felt the shift internally. Over time, I heard that her professional image was beginning to fracture, not dramatically but subtly, the way things do when authenticity erodes. Colleagues noticed inconsistencies. Her online following, which had once climbed steadily, began to plateau and then shrink, engagement dipping as audiences moved on to newer personalities with fresher narratives. Without the stability of our home and the quiet support system I provided, her schedule grew more chaotic, the polished image harder to maintain months later. On an otherwise ordinary evening, I received a voice message from her. I stared at the notification for several minutes before pressing play. Her tone was softer than I remembered, stripped of the performative confidence she once wore like armor. She admitted that she had confused attention with value, that the validation she chased had felt intoxicating but hollow, and that in the process she had underestimated the man she mocked, mistaking steadiness for smallness. She said she did not expect forgiveness, only wanted me to know that she finally understood what she had dismissed. I listened without anger, without triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement of how far I had come since standing in her driveway hearing myself described as too safe to replace. I did not respond immediately, and when I eventually did, it was brief, respectful, and final. There was no need for raised voices, no dramatic closure scene, because the closure had already happened the moment I chose dignity over retaliation. I reclaimed my life not by destroying hers publicly, but by stepping out of the role she assigned me and refusing to shrink to fit her narrative. In the end, I did not need to win an argument or prove my worth through spectacle, because peace arrived in the absence of noise, And for the first time in years, I felt fully aligned with the man I had always been, steady, disciplined, and no longer standing in anyone else's shadow.